gruesome story of fruits, sex, murder, and mutiny. Walking along just right now, doing my daily jog, I looked to the ground and I saw something very interesting. Check this out. Right here on the ground, this fruit is lying around. What is it? This is a breadfruit. And what the heck does it have to do with murder, sex, and mutiny? Let's start at the beginning. You may have heard about a gentleman called James Cook, the famous mariner and explorer. In 1769, he arrived in Tahiti with a gentleman called Banks. Banks was the expedition botanist. And Banks in Tahiti found a tree, the one that is right behind me here, looked inside the tree and realized that the tree was populated by globulous fruits. Clearly see them there, these little globulous fruits. And the name for them is Altocarpus altilis. Why would this fruit be so interesting? The more Banks looked at it, he realized that this fruit was incredible. You could actually bake it, fry it, bury it between 1 to up to 20 years, where it would ferment into a pasty, starchy substance. It was a phenomenal source of nutrition and starch. Now, why would Joseph Banks find that specifically interesting? Because the British Empire had started building their colonies also in the West Indies or in the Caribbean. And they had brought African slaves in. And the problem was this, they were sorely short of nutrition. Joseph Banks went, wait a second, this might be the solution to feed all the African slaves in the West Indies. Upon his return to England, Joseph Banks became Sir Joseph Banks, quite successful, and based on all his experiences with the expedition of Captain Cook around the world, and having brought back a wealth of scientific knowledge, specifically also in botany, he was made the president of the Royal Society, a very important post in England. And as such, he said, hey, listen, we can solve this economic problem of how to feed the slaves. I'm not here to discuss the goodness or badness of slavery. We all agree it's bad, but those were different times. He actually started lobbying the British government to say, let's send some people to Tahiti, grab this product called breadfruit and bring it over to the West Indies to start a planting program there. This brings us one step closer to the mystery of why I'm talking about mutiny. Because the ship that they chose to send the expedition to Tahiti was called the Bounty. You might have heard about that. Mutiny on the Bounty. So how did this mutiny get on the road? We need to talk about the main players. One of them was Captain William Bligh. He was a man who was raised in humble circumstances and worked his way to the top of his profession, becoming a brilliant navigator. Now, Bligh had a reputation as being very even-handed as a captain and very modern in our sense, because in those times, captains were rough. They mainly ruled by flogging, punishment, keel-holding, and even hanging crew members. One must also understand why, because many crew members became sailors against their will. They were literally dragged out of a canteen sometimes, drunk, put on a ship, and when they woke up, they were out at sea. Semi-enslavement. Bligh was not that sort of captain. He was almost seen as too friendly, maybe too weak for the time, which makes what happened even stranger to understand. The second player in the drama is a guy called Fletcher Christian. Unlike Bligh, Fletcher Christian came from gentry, impoverished gentry. Once his father died, his mother was so with her money management that she went in such debt she almost ended up in debtor's prison. Young Fletcher Christian had to go to sea to make a living, and he even was on an expedition together with Bligh, so they knew each other, and Bligh was very positively disposed towards Fletcher Christian, to such a degree that when the expedition finally was called out and Bligh was made the captain, Bligh requested the presence of Fletcher Christian on his ship. Off the Bounty went, and in October of 1788, it arrived in Tahiti. Once they reached Tahiti, this is where some interesting things start happening. The Tahitian culture, and specifically also the Polynesian culture, was completely different from the Western culture. One specific thing that was very different was their sexual mores. In the Western culture, sexual mores are strict, if you so wish, and in the Polynesia of then they were loose. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. Let me explain. For example, in the West, it's still tradition, you should stay virgin until you marry. Whilst in the Polynesian culture, they said, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense at all. Because in the West, you need to stay virgin until you marry. And if you're not a virgin, you're a bad person before you marry, right? You're loose.
How dare you?
And guess what? The Polynesians had an interesting viewpoint. They said, tell you what, before you marry, have as much fun as you want with everybody. You know, have some fun, explore your eroticism. But now that you have explored it all, you kind of figure it out. And once you get married, kind of stay faithful to your partner. What happens is all these sexually repressed men come off a ship in a society in England that as a sailor you were just societal dirt, and all of a sudden you were a hot commodity to the women of Otaheite or Tahiti. What would you feel like? Would you want to get back on the boat and sail back to England and being treated like dirt again?
Oh, hell no!
Gets kind of tough, right? So after 5 months, when it was go time, we have to sail to the West Indies, quite a few of the sailors were not exactly super excited about the prospect. This leads us to the 28th of April, 1789. What happened? Bounty was sailing, direction West Indies. And in that night, Fletcher Christian, on the night watch, got a hold of the keys that opened up the door to the weaponry. And he and a few of his men took over the ship. They put Captain Bligh and 18 men into a boat that had only 5 inches above the waterline. Not only that, they only gave him one compass, no chronometer and no sea charts. A chronometer will allow you to figure out how far you've sailed, and of course a sea chart might be helpful in finding where you are. So they thought, the guy's not gonna make it. I mean, he's a fair shot, but whatever. The fact is that Captain Bligh was one of the best mariners of his generation. He deadheaded for 6,000 kilometers plus across the ocean, only stopping once on one island where one of his guys got killed. He says, that's it, we're not stopping, until he got to the town of Kupang in Timor, which was Dutch East Indian Territory. To this day, nobody knows what really possessed Fletcher Christian to stand up against his mentor. We have no idea. It is reported that he mumbled when Bligh looked at him and says, but you have been cradling my kids on your knees. What are you doing? That Fletcher Christian mumbled, I'm in hell, if that be true. So obviously the guy, something went wrong in his head. The mission that Bligh had now from Kupang was to get back to London, report what happened and clear his name. Fletcher Christian had the opposite mission, to get the heck off the map, to disappear, because he knew the whole might of the British Navy would be out looking for him. First thing he did is he turned the bounty around and went back to Tahiti, where he got some local natives, or the Polynesians. They got 9 guys, 11 girls, and he married a local chieftain's daughter called Maimiti. Then they went like, where do we go now? Because the British Navy will find us, big as the world is. And then they remembered there is a small group of islands called the Pitcairns. The Pitcairns are still to this day the most forlorn, lost, faraway islands in the world. And the chances were really big that nobody would go looking for the Pitcairns at all, because we're not really in popular consciousness. They sailed for the Pitcairns, arrived at the Pitcairns, about 6 to 7 mutineers, 9 Polynesian men, 11 Polynesian women. Arrived there, burned the ship, so it was gone, nobody could find it, and disappeared into the island. In the meantime, good Mr. Bligh had been cleared by the courts in London, and another ship had been sent out to look for them, the ship Pandora. Pandora never found them. However, by 1808, a ship happened to come by the Pitcairns, and this is what they found. They found one guy alive, John Adams, one of the original mutineers, and 9 Polynesian women, and a clutch of children. What had happened? Well, it's called cabin fever. Small island, a group of people that will literally cannibalize each other. So the first thing that happened was that the British enslaved the Polynesian men. That was their dream. And of course, sexually enslaved the women, because that was what it's all about. And in the meantime, what happened, of course, the Polynesian men, who are natural warriors, did not take kindly to that. And what ensued was rivalry, sexual rivalry, food rivalry, upheaval, murder, until the only guy left standing was Mr. Adams and a clutch of children and 9 women. Of course, history has a way to make a hash of everything. So as time went on, when you hear Mutiny on the Bounty, you think about voluptuous Polynesian women in sarongs or pareus, and you think about, Fletcher Christian being this amazing character, played by Marlon Brando in the 60s, and romanticized up the yin-yang. In reality, it was a sordid story of social oppression by the British within their own society, oppressing their own people, their sailors, to the degree they didn't want to go back. The sailors oppressing the Polynesian people to the point that they had to kill them in return. It's a horridly sordid tale, and karma caught up with them all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.